All right, let's talk about Catelyn II. Catelyn II, this was always one of my favorite chapters. In fact, I think it's the chapter that really brought me into the story. The first five chapters or so are a lot of setting and exposition, and the real action of the story begins in Catelyn II, and you really get some intrigue on what the characters are doing, and you want to keep reading after that. The first chapters, yeah, like I say, a lot of setting, but this is the one that really pulls you in to kind of what we think of, a Game of Thrones being about, a Song of Ice and Fire being about, all the complicated relationships and subterfuge. Anyway, let's begin. Of all the rooms in Winterfell's Great Keep, Catelyn's bedchambers were the hottest. She seldom had to light a fire. The castle had been built over natural hot springs, and the scalding waters rushed through the walls and chambers like blood through a man's body, driving the chill from the stone halls, filling the glass gardens with a moist warmth, keeping the earth from freezing. Open pools smoked day and night in a dozen small courtyards. That was a little thing. In summer and winter, it was the difference between life and death. Now, this is an interesting way to start, because here we find out that Winterfell, in fact, is not a cold place, even though Bran had stories about sitting around the hearth, that the castle is geothermally heated, and it's actually quite warm. And the bedchambers are the warmest and hottest. Now we later find out that, well, we'll get to this, but it's a little bit of a contradiction to Bran. But I suppose, I mean, you can come up with ways to make it work. That Bran's bedchambers are in a colder part of the castle, and that's why he's always sitting around the hearth with old Nan or something like that. But I always thought it was kind of funny because it's not super necessary to have this story about this geothermally heated castle with glass gardens and all of these things. It's an interesting little touch, but this idea that it hasn't yet really been important to the story. Like, yes, Theon comes in later and it's all kind of broken and the Winterfell is very cold, but one could see maybe this is foreshadowing that the difference between life and death are these geothermally heated pools that they don't seem to have working come a Dance with Dragons. But I think it was a later edit that even the wedding was going to be at Winterfell. But anyway, Catelyn's bath was hot and steaming. Here we go. Catelyn's bath was hot and steaming, and her walls were warm to the touch. The warmth reminded her of Riverrun, of days in the sun with Lysa and Edmure. Just a little exposition, giving her siblings. But Ned could never abide the heat. The Starks were made for the cold, he would tell her, and she would laugh and tell him, in that case, they had certainly built their castle in the wrong place. Now, we later find out in the second Bran chapter that, in fact, the first keep is not on this geothermally heated thing. But there is this question of why is Winterfell built where it is? And it does seem to be that, these geothermally heated pools, but, they mentioned that it keeps the earth from freezing, which may have something to do with keeping that werewood alive and stuff like that. That Winterfell is probably where it is because the werewood is where it is, would be my guess. But there's this interesting thing here. It sticks out that the Starks had, if they didn't like the heat, the Starks built their castle in the wrong place. Because you start asking why is Winterfell where it is? What's so special about that area? Now, of course, this paragraph is a reference back to the Daenerys chapter, where Daenerys is taking a bath, and you find out that the Targaryens like the heat, and here we find out that the Starks like the cold, and we're introduced to these two facts when talking about baths. It's pretty clear that our author has been thinking about these two things. But even though through most of this story, the Starks and Lannisters are opposed to each other, this is the first time we get Starks and Targaryens as some sort of mirror. One being the cold ones, and one being the hot ones. But yes, if you put all the pieces together, the Starks can be in the cold because the first keep was in the was not so warm. So when they had finished, Ned rolled off and climbed from her bed, as he had 1,000 times before. So Ned doesn't like to cuddle. George uses things like 1,000 times and 1,000 years in the story in the writing. It doesn't necessarily mean literally 1,000. It can be 1,000,000. It can be 100, but 1,000 times is just kind of like a lot. But 1,000 times might be around about. I mean, they've been married, 15 years. You start doing the math. 50 times a year, once a week. You start getting the math. That's 750 times. So it's about right. But it's interesting that he climbs from their bed 1,000 times before. So he doesn't like cuddling. There's a certain distance if you're really talking about this. What someone does after sex is a kind of an interesting thing. He crossed the room, pulled back the heavy tapestries, and threw open the high, narrow windows one by one, letting in the night air into the chamber. The wind swirled around him as he stood facing the dark, naked and empty-handed. Catelyn pulled the furs to her chin and watched him. He looked somehow smaller and more vulnerable, like the youth she had wed in the Septon River Run 15 long years gone. Her loins still ached from the urgency of his lovemaking. It was a good ache. She could feel his seed within her. She prayed that it might quicken there. It had been 3 years since Rickon. She was not too old. She would give him another son. Kat's about 33, 34 in this scene. So yeah, she's perfectly capable of having another child. People are often surprised by that because they watch the show and the actors are aged up. But this is mostly exposition. But you get this idea, the urgency of the lovemaking. I don't know why, all of a sudden Ned was horny this day, but he apparently was, and urgently needed to bang Cat. I will refuse him, Ned said as he turned back to her. His eyes were haunted, his voice thick with doubt. Now, in the story, we're never quite sure why Ned doesn't want to go south. In his own head, he says, that he belongs in the north, that he feels comfortable there. And later he says, I have duties here in the north. But the fact that he says this right after their sex implies that, he doesn't want to leave because he doesn't want to leave his wife. But even though he never thinks about that, and he doesn't tell Cat that, the fact that this comes up as a topic right after sex seems to be that he's thinking about her when he says this, and which is it's a nice thought, but he sort of, what's funny is he doesn't tell himself. It's more on a subconscious level. He doesn't tell himself this. He doesn't tell Cat this, but the fact that it comes up right after sex, unless he's thinking about something else when he's looking out the window, which is quite possible because, there's issues of whether or not he's still thinking about a Shara Dane or something like that after all of these years. So then Cat sat up in the bed. You cannot. You must not. Oh, and of course, some people would be like, oh no, it has something to do with Jon Snow. He needs to stay around for Jon Snow. I'm sure there's people, the Jon obsessed people that are going to be like, he doesn't want He doesn't want to head south because of Jon. You cannot. You must not. Now, it is the weird thing that, like, Catelyn is the one that doesn't want, or wants him to go, which is a swap in the show. So people often get this wrong. But this is an important thing. Cat wants him to go, which is weird, right? Why would she want her husband to go? My duties are here in the north. I have no wish to be Robert's hand. And, you know, Ned in his own head, like, let's say we can go back, and it says right here at the end of Eddard 1, he said, he's offered the handship, and he says, for a moment, Eddard Stark was filled with a terrible sense of foreboding. This was his place here in the north. He looked at the stone figures around him, breathed deep in the chill silence of the crypts. He could feel the eyes of the dead. They were all listening, he knew, and winter was coming. You know, like, we're not sure what it is. Like, what is that fear? You know, I mean, people can come up with a lot of explanations. He doesn't want to go south because it reminds him of Lyanna, you know, and that's certainly what happens with his dreams later. His dreams get worse, and, you know, the south reminds him of that, and north is a comfortable place. But of course, it's also very odd considering that, you know, Ned spent many years outside of the north, in the Vale, and, you know, maybe he feels quite, you know, he should feel quite comfortable outside of the north, but no, he feels the north is his place, almost in kind of a reverse situation of Jon, where Jon always feels like the crypts was not his place, and Winterfell was always saying, this is not your place. You know, he's getting these dreams that, no, you can't be the Lord of Winterfell. But Ned is getting the reverse, that I need to be here. You know, and you can say, okay, maybe the South reminds him of Lyanna. Maybe he doesn't want to leave his wife. Maybe he has some spooky reason. But it's a big question. I don't hear people talk about it too much. But, like, why was Ned so compelled to stay in the North? And what did he really fear about heading south? You know, he didn't like the power? You know, he didn't want to be around Robert. You know, like, we're not sure. Cat says, he will not understand that. He is king now, and kings are not like other men. If you refuse to serve him, he will wonder why, and sooner or later he will begin to suspect that you oppose him. Can't you see the danger that would put us in? Ned shook his head, refusing to believe. Robert would never harm me or any of mine. We are closer than brothers. He loves me. If I refuse him, he will roar and curse and bluster, and in a week he will laugh about it together. I know the man. Now, you knew the man, she said. The king is a stranger to you. I actually really like these paragraphs here because, in a sense, Cat and Ned are both right. You know, Cat is correct that Robert would be insulted if Ned refused him. And you can see Robert's temper throughout the story. You know, and how angry he gets at Ned at various times, especially, you know, with the Daenerys situation, the Daenerys poison situation and things like that. At the same time, in the end, like, Ned is actually correct, because in the end, it's true. He cursed and blustered, and then they laughed about it together, and he changed his mind, and he knew that Ned was right. And granted, it was on his deathbed, but, like, Ned is right about Robert. Robert, in the end, knows what's right and wrong, and understands friendship and things like that. So I always really liked these paragraphs because, you know, this is very, Cat is being, she's signaling the future. Like, the entire book, he's discovering this idea of, like, you knew the man. You don't know who Robert is now. And it's true that, like, Ned spends the entire book, like, discovering who Robert Baratheon is. on his trip south. And in the end, no. He keeps thinking, oh, maybe Ned is different. He goes down there and discovers this horrible relationship with Cersei, and then discovers, like, oh, is he willing to kill a little girl? He's discovering what a horrible human being and a different man than he thought he was. Kat's right until she's not, until Ned is actually right. That Ned knows him, because Robert does have his change of heart because Ned did know him, and he was the good man in the end. Anyway, I always love these two paragraphs together. But here we get the real reason that Cat wants Ned to head south. Cat remembered the direwolf in the snow, the broken antler lodged deep in her throat. She had to make him see. So Jon Snow, with his whole, oh, this is a sign bullshit, it didn't fool Ned. Ned doesn't think about that at all. But ironically, it fools Catelyn, right? Like, it's Cat who believes in signs. She's the one. Jon Snow's bullshit works on Cat, and she's the one that is convinced that this is a sign. Even though we're not sure what kind of antler it is and all of that, she assumes that it's a stag antler, and the direwolf represents House Stark, and so she does not want to see any sort of conflict between Baratheon and Stark, which is what she sees here. Pride is everything to a king, my lord. Robert came all this way to see you, to bring you these great honors. You cannot throw them back in his face. Honors? Ned laughed bitterly. In his eyes, yes, she said. And that in truth is, Cat's right. Cat's absolutely right. And then he's like, in yours? And she says, and in mine. She blazed angrily now. Why couldn't he see this? Why couldn't he see? And it's weird. So we find out that Cat really cares about the prophecy. She really thinks about the supernatural here. But then the second reason of Sansa being queen comes in. And it's a secondary reason for Catelyn. But Ned is thinking that it's her primary reason. And so he's thinking that she's just, thinking about self-gain. Or family gain, not really self-gain, but, and she is very worried about, for instance, Robb and his claim to Winterfell and things like that. Like she's worried about the feudal structure and her children's place in it. He offers his own son in marriage to our daughter. And what would you call that? Sansa might someday be queen. Her sons could rule from the wall to the mountains of Dorne. A little weird here. George, when these chapters were written, George didn't know the geography. Dorne was a place. He didn't have the map. The mountains of Dorne, we know, are kind of the border, the marches between it and the Reach and the Stormlands, and really, like, it's desert past that, like flat, and so. It's a little weird. It's a little off. She could have said the sands of Dorne, from the wall to the sands of Dorne, but she says the mountains of Dorne, because the geography's off. But little retcons. What is so wrong with that? Gods, Catelyn, Sansa's only 11, Ned said, and Joffrey is, and I guess this is a somewhat implication that that everybody sees that Joffrey's off. That Ned just doesn't like him. And that, yes, betrothing her at 11 is a little off. And keep in mind, the same things were, I think I'm trying to think, Catelyn, Catelyn later says that she was betrothed at a similar age. Lyanna too. I think this is hinting that all of the way that they were raised was bad, and Ned kind of recognizes this. She finished for him. the crown prince, the heir to the Iron Throne, and I was only 12, and my father promised me to your brother. See, this is the thing right here. And this is a very kind of similar conversation to Romeo and Juliet, where you, at the beginning of that play, Juliet's father thinks that Juliet is too young to be betrothed, even though he was betrothed at the same age. So the characters understand that their world is, a lot of people read these stories and they're like, well, this was all normal, so it's fine, because the characters in story understand that this is off. They understand that their world is kind of screwed up, just like in Romeo and Juliet. They understood that their world was screwed up. Just because you go through it yourself doesn't mean you don't understand that something is wrong. So Ned is recognizing this here quite clearly, that these are. But the subject gets changed a little. That brought bitter twist to Ned's mouth. Brandon. Yes, Brandon would know what to do. He always did. It was always meant for Brandon. And then we get some bitterness with Ned, considering his brother was murdered horribly. And he later built a statue to Brandon. We get this odd anger here, and we're not sure what it's about. Later we hear with the Lady Dustin story that Brandon was kind of a dick. Maybe confident, and everything, but what was it? He's still harboring jealousy for his dead brother, but at the same time he built a statue to him to honor him. So what is the relationship between Ned and Brandon? We don't know. It's still at this point hasn't been explained, but we can kind of see that there's this big, complicated backstory that we don't know about. You, Winterfell everything. He was born to be king's hand and father to queens. I never asked for this cup to pass to me. And that's the big thing is what, okay. Even though Ned seems to, like his wife and like his kids and thinks the North is his place, he never asked for the cup to pass to him. So what life did Ned want? And we don't really understand what it was. I mean, obviously Ned grew up thinking he wasn't going to be heir, that he was going to live some other life. Maybe it has something to do with falling in love with Ashara Dane and wanting to be with her. We're not sure. But he seems somewhat unhappy with his position. He didn't want this responsibility. He wanted something else. He had a different choice. Perhaps not, Catelyn said, but Brandon is dead and the cup has passed, and you must drink from it, like or not. I mean, and I understand that this is all exposition. They're giving the backstory, but Ned does seem upset. And so Ned turned away from her back to the night. He stood staring out into the darkness, watching the moon and the stars, perhaps. Or perhaps the sentries on the wall. So what life was Ned looking to? And so he kind of looks to the stars, the moon and stars. Which, this is these things of looking to the stars and the moon and stuff like that. I mean, you can maybe say maybe it relates to Quaithe because Daenerys is always looking to the stars, or people are watching the stars and moon. It seems like when our characters are being watched by other powers, the stars and the moon and things like that are watching them. So we're not sure. We're not sure what he's watching and thinking about. What's watching him. All we hear about is we don't have very much to go on, but all we hear about is this character of Ashara Dane. So maybe he's thinking about her. I don't know. Maybe he's thinking about the fisherman's daughter. Maybe he's thinking about Wyla. It's hard to say. Never explained. Catelyn softened then to see his pain. What pain? Right? I mean, What pain? Like, why is he so angry at Brandon? What did he not want? I mean, I suppose, like, maybe one could say he feels guilty for Brandon's death, but he seems angry at Brandon. You know, it's a bitter twist in Ned's mouth. So I mean, maybe it's feeling guilty, feeling guilty that Brandon's dead and he never wanted all of that. That his life is so great, but it came at the expense of Brandon being killed. Eddard Stark had married her in Brandon's place, as custom decreed, but the shadow of his dead brother still lay between them, as did the other, the shadow of the woman he would not name. And here we go. The woman who had borne him his bastard son. Now, one could say, okay, maybe it's just he's thinking about Lyanna and Brandon both dying. And everything about the South reminds him of Brandon and Lyanna. King's Landing reminds him of Brandon and Lyanna. Brandon especially because he died there. And maybe it has nothing to do with Ashardane. Who knows? Or maybe it has to do with all of them. She was about to go to him when a knock came at the door, loud and unexpected. Ned turned frowning. What is it? Desmond's voice came through the door. My lord, Maester Luwin is without and begs urgent audience. Okay, and so we heard about Maester Luwin before. I should mention that the Maesters are an interesting order. Originally they were called in George's early drafts. They were called Wisdoms. You would say Wisdom Luwin, and George had done this in a previous story, The Glass Flower, naming people with the title Wisdom. He later uses that for his pyromancers. They have the title Wisdom instead. But he kind of liked this idea that these characters would be named Wisdom. I always, you can kind of relate it to the fact that, like, Mirri Maz Duur, her title means wise, and things like that. But it was changed to Maester. I imagine that the reason was because Wisdom is a title in Wheel of Time, which was... When was the first Wheel of Time book published? The first Wheel of Time book... Yeah, the first Wheel of Time book kind of came out and was published in 1990. So, it hadn't had a huge, maybe it hadn't grown in popularity yet, but, when he first wrote these chapters, which was like 91, that, he had written Wisdom or something, and then the Wheel of Time books then took off and were quite popular by, I think they start being on like their fifth book by like 93 and 94 when he starts revising these fifth and sixth book. They're in their heyday. That's when things were super popular with the Wheel of Time books. And so I imagine that he changed Wisdom to Maester for that reason. But the order of the Maesters, it very much reminds you of like the Mentat and the Bene Gesserit from Dune and things like that, having these close, this conspiracy group, but also these close advisors about. You told him I left orders not to be disturbed. Yes, my lord, he insists. Very well, send him in. Ned crossed to the wardrobe and slipped on a heavy robe. Catelyn realized suddenly how cold it had become. She sat up in bed and pulled the furs to her chin. Perhaps we should close the windows, she suggested. Ned nodded absently. Maester Luwin was shown in. But I don't think the windows were closed. The Maester was a small gray man. His eyes were gray and quick and saw much. His hair was gray, what little the years had left him. His robe was gray wool, trimmed with white fur, the stark colors. Yeah, this is weird. This is retconned because, yes, he's got a gray robe, And then it says, oh, it's trimmed with white fur because that's the stark colors. But all of the maesters have gray robes. It has nothing to do with the colors of the house. So this is I think probably originally he was wearing a robe that was he was thinking that all of these maesters would have robes that were the colors of their houses, but that got changed and they all had gray in the end. Because this is just this is just kind of off. That he's not wearing gray because it's the stark colors. He's wearing gray because it's gray. Their robes are gray. Its great floppy sleeves had pockets hidden inside, and Lewin always was tucking things into those sleeves and producing other things from them: books, messages, strange artifacts, toys for children. So you get this idea that there's some secrecy. He's at least a sort of magician with these weird robes and hidden pockets. All of a sudden, like just from the introduction, you get this idea that there's secrets that the maesters keep. With all he kept hidden in his sleeves, Catelyn was surprised that Maester Lewin could lift his arms at all. The maester waited until the door had closed behind him before he spoke. "My lord," he said to Ned, "pardon for disturbing your rest. I have been left a message." Ned looked irritated. "Been left? By whom? Has there been a rider? I was not told." "There was no rider, my lord. Only a carved wooden box, left on a table in my observatory while I napped. My servants saw no one else, but it must have been brought by someone in the king's party. We have had no other visitors from the south." This little story about the wooden box I always thought was interesting because it goes on for a little bit, and it doesn't need to be anything. It could, like, someone could have just left a message and it could have just been that. But instead he tells this like long story about this box, which is, it's interesting. It's colorful. I always thought it was quite funny. But anyway, we've had no other visitors from the south is a very weird line because what visitors from the north have come? I suppose Benjen, but this is why people say, like, okay, no other visitors from the south, then the person that left the box must have been from the north. So maybe, something like that. But in the end, it is somebody hidden into the king's party. But yeah, some weird things like who are the visitors from the north? No other visitors from the south. Like, he could have just said, there was no rider. My servants saw no one, but it must have been brought somebody in the king's party. No other visitors from the south. I guess he's talking about Benjen, but is he the only visitor from the north? Or he could be saying the south as in, like, not directionally, but like other people came from the north. But he's talking about the south as the land beyond the neck. So, for instance, if somebody came from White Harbor, you're still coming, even though you're coming from directionally the south, you're still coming from the north. But it's an odd thing because you immediately are like, well, wait, who are these other visitors from the non-south? Couldn't they have, done it? Anyway, it's not really explained ever, like how Littlefinger did get this box in there, and why they were in the king's party, how they got in the king's party, and all of that. A wooden box, you say, Catelyn said. Inside was a fine new lens for the observatory. For Mir, by the look of it, the lens crafters of Mir without equal. Ned frowned. He had little patience for this sort of thing, Catelyn knew. A lens, he said. What does it have to do with me? I imagine. I mean, it may be that he needed to talk about this lens because I'm not sure if Lewin had a lens tube before, but maybe this is his first lens tube, and so later he's going to be using it for the comet or something. But I don't know if George even had those sorts of ideas. But maybe he thought at some point I'm going to have some sort of celestial plot, so I need Winterfell to have a lens. Ned frowned. He had little patience for this sort of thing. What does it have to do with me? I asked the same question. Clearly there was more to this than the seeming. Under the heavy weight of her furs, Catelyn shivered. A lens is an instrument to help us see. Indeed it is. He fingered the collar of his order, a heavy chain worn tight around the neck beneath his robe, each link forged from a different metal. This is one of the things that, like, in the show, everybody has these loose maester chains, but the maester chains are like these tight metal chokers in here. Very, very different. So they're always uncomfortable. Catelyn can feel dread stirring inside her once again. What is it that you would have of us seem? What is it that they would have us see more clearly? The very thing I asked myself. Maester Lewin drew a tightly rolled paper out of his sleeve. I found the true message concealed within a false bottom. When I dismantled the box, the lens had come in. But it is not for my eyes. This is it's this big roundabout story about this lens. He could have just been like, this message was left for me, but instead he tells this long story about this lens. So, somehow, as we know, Littlefinger, he's got the money, he's got the wealth. He bought this lens from Myr. He's got his connections across the Narrow Sea. Planted this message in the Queen's party that went north with some sort of servant. But it does mean that Littlefinger has a man at Winterfell right now, which kind of later you could wonder, the cat's paw and things like that. But this was his long plan. But though at the time, George, when he wrote this, he hadn't figured this out at all. Catelyn can feel dread stirring once again inside her once again. What is it? By the way, I think this is also kind of funny because, like, if we go back, remember, like, the thing that she felt stirring inside her was Ned's seed. Now she's feeling dread stirring in her. Anyway, let me have it then. Lewin did not stir. Pardons, my lord. The message is not for you either. It is marked for the eyes of Lady Catelyn and her alone. May I approach? Catelyn nodded, not trusting to speak. The maester placed the paper on the table beside the bed. It was sealed with a blob of blue wax. Lewin bowed and began to retreat. And then we hear about the wax. Now, wax and seals were very much used for, until quite recently, as for authenticity and signature on stuff. And we hear a lot of it in the story. And yet, there is not one proven false letter yet. I would say that there's certain ones that I would question. For instance, the order of the guards to take Gendry from Arya's Night's Watch group. There is, the marriage contract between Quentyn and Daenerys. There is the pink letter. All sorts of things that we can question the veracity of, but we get a lot of this wax stuff, and we have not yet had a proven false letter. Stay, Ned commanded. His voice was grave. He looked at Catelyn. What is it, my lady? You're shaking. I'm afraid, she admitted. She reached out and took the letter in trembling hands. The furs dropped away from her nakedness, forgotten. In the blue wax was the moon and falcon seal of House Arryn. It's from Lysa. Catelyn looked at her husband. It will not make us glad, she told him. There's grief in this message, Ned. I can feel it. Ned frowned, his face darkening. Open it. Catelyn opened the seal. And of course, like, she must have, if these are these things that, I don't know if, like, George thought this out, but, like, Lysa has already fled. She's already fled to the Eyrie. So how is she getting a rider integrated into the king's party? And it's like, okay, well, maybe she wrote the letter before she fled and gave it to Littlefinger, and then Littlefinger put it in the box and put it with his man who went with the king with the king's party. Her eyes moved over the words. At first, it made no sense to her. Then she remembered. Lysa took no chances. When we were girls, we had a private language, she and I. This private language has not yet come back. I always thought it was really interesting that Catelyn and Lysa have this secret language, and it's never referenced again. I feel like it should come back at some point. Can you read it? Yes, Catelyn admitted. Then tell us. Perhaps I should withdraw, Maester Luwin said. No, Catelyn said. We will need your counsel. And this is one of these hints that Luwin has integrated himself into the family. Like, he tries to leave several times. He tries to retreat. He's like, I don't want any part of this. And they're like, stay. And he's like, really? Maybe I should leave. No, we're going to need your counsel. She threw back the furs and climbed from the bed. The night air was cold. It was cold as the grave on her. The night air was as cold as the grave. On her bare skin as she padded across the room. I always laughed at this because, they had just finished having sex, and she just talked about how, she was filled with Ned's semen. And so now she's padding across the room, meaning like his semen is dripping out of her as she's padding across the room. And I always laughed at this, but like, George has probably forgotten about this and doesn't think about it. But like, this is one of those things that like no one talks about. Like Catelyn padding across the room, semen dripping out of her to the fireplace. Maester Luwin averted his eyes. Even Ned looked shocked. What are you doing? Lighting a fire, Catelyn told him. She found a dressing gown and shrugged into it, then knelt over the cold hearth. Maester Luwin, Ned began. Maester Luwin has delivered all of my children, Catelyn said. It's no time for false modesty. Later this gets retconned, because maybe, we're not sure, because Luwin was certainly sure her first baby is at River Run. And so the idea that somehow Luwin would be the maester at River Run and then follow her to Winterfell is a little weird. Now, granted, we know that there was a previous maester called Weiss who was before Luwin, but it's one of these lines that people analyze and go, well, logically speaking, Luwin must have been at River Run. And so if Luwin was the maester at River Run, maybe Luwin is the maester that actually gave Lysa the moon tea that caused her, the tansy tea that caused her so much trouble and things like that. But when you go through and you see how many retcons have happened, and that it's like, who knows? She slid the paper in among the kindling and placed the heavier logs on top of it. Ned crossed the room, took her by the arm and pulled her to her feet. He held her there, his face inches from her. My lady, tell me, what was this message? It's so weird that she decides to as if you need all of this kindling and heavier logs. because she's just burning one piece of paper. But she could have just, took a candle to it and it would have been burned up. But instead, she's like putting kindling, starting the kindling, getting it started, and then putting a heavy. I mean, I feel like George has never built a fire. So, so usually what happens is you have, when you start, well, he clearly hasn't, because if you're going to start a fire, you start with tinder. Tinder is the first thing, and then you add kindling, and then you add sticks, and then after the sticks get going for a while, you then put on heavier logs. Okay, you're not going to go paper kindling heavier logs unless, I mean, it's just so weird. It's just George has never built a fire. Okay, but this process would also, like, starting a fire takes like, takes like 15, 20 minutes at least, Anyway, Catelyn stiffened in his grasp. A warning, she said softly. If we have the wits to hear. His eyes searched her face. Go on. I also find it funny, like the burning thing. Like she goes through all of this trouble to burn the message. Lysa says Jon Arryn was murdered. His fingers tightened on her arm. By whom? The Lannisters, she told him. The Queen. And now this is very interesting. If the recent research by G Stuff is correct, that in the original drafts, like the Queen was the murderer, then we're told right off the bat. And certainly on the first read of A Game of Thrones before the other books, you're supposed to assume it's the Queen. You're supposed to assume it's Jaime and the Queen. And so we kind of have a Columbo situation. In case you don't know, Columbo is this murder mystery show where they tell you who the killer was right at the beginning. And the joy of the show is seeing how Columbo catches them. It's not it's a whodunit, but it's a whodunit where you already know who did it. It's about how Columbo figures it out. Which always was very funny, like you're taking away that mystery and putting it right up front. And so here, in a sense, like at least how it was originally written, the Columbo mystery, it's right up front. The Queen murdered Jon Arryn. However, I do have to say on first read, you stop caring about the Jon Arryn murder. Like, yes, Ned is going around trying to figure out the Jon Arryn murder, but you've already seen Cersei and Jaime push Bran from the tower. So you kind of think that's a worse crime because Bran is the main character and who cares about Jon Arryn. So these other mysteries, I understand that like the Catspaw mystery and the Jon Arryn mystery, are go for several books, but it's kind of a lesser mystery, because it happens to characters that you don't really care about as much. I mean, yes, the Catspaw thing like happens to Catelyn and Bran, but no one dies. So, the Bran getting pushed from the tower already like implicates the Lannisters. So you're kind of even though there are twists and turns that George adds these layers to, it is a Columbo mystery where you're like, oh, like, but the Lannisters already did it. It's all about Ned discovering it, like Columbo. Gods, he whispered. His voice was hoarse. Your sister was sick with grief. She cannot know what she's saying. She knows, Catelyn said. Lysa is impulsive, yes, but this message was carefully planned, cleverly hidden. She knew it meant death if her letter fell into the wrong hands. To risk so much, she must have had more than mere suspicion. Catelyn looked to her husband. Now we truly have no choice. You must be Robert's hand. You must go south with him and learn the truth. She saw at once that Ned had reached a very different conclusion. The only truths I know are here. The south is a nest of adders I'd do better to avoid. Lewin plucked at his chain collar where it had chafed the soft skin of his throat. The hand of the king has great power, my lord. Power to find the truth of Lord Aaron's death, to bring his killers to the king's justice. Power to protect Lady Aaron and her son, if the worst be true. Interesting that Lewin takes Catelyn's side. Which I suppose would like play into this idea that he was the Riverrun Maester, but and it was following Catelyn in order to be loyal to Catelyn, or maybe he's just giving the advice that he thinks is the best. It's hard to say. Ned glanced helplessly around the bedchamber. Catelyn's heart went out to him, but she knew she could not take him in her arms just then. First, the victory must be won for her children's sake. You say you love Robert like a brother. Would you leave your brother surrounded by Lannisters? The others take you both, Ned muttered darkly. He turned away from them and went to the window. She did not speak, nor did the maester. They waited, quiet. And this is, it's interesting the placing in the others here. Because, like I say, they say the others take you quite a bit at the beginning, and then they kind of drop the phrase. But we're now in the middle of this murder mystery, and we're forgetting about the first chapter of the book and the supernatural creatures that threaten the realm. And then we get this reminder here that, oh yeah, there's actually something more important going on, but whatever, Ned is getting taken away from it all. There's a lot of jokes that like everything that Littlefinger does actually like plays into the other's hands, that maybe Littlefinger works for the others, but anyway. They waited quiet while Eddard Stark said a silent farewell to the home he loved. When he turned away from the window at last, his voice was tired and full of melancholy, and moisture glittered faintly in the corners of his eyes. My father went south once to answer the summons of a king. He never came home again. And maybe that's it, Maybe that's the real reason, is that he doesn't want to die like his father did. His father, like that, King's Landing reminds him of his father, and that's the real reason that he doesn't want to go south, and that's the dread. His father, his brother, just reminds him of and I suppose, I guess that's the answer that's the conclusion we really have to come to. That the dread of him being Hand was that King's Landing reminds him of his father and his brother, because that's the place they died. And he doesn't want to die there too. And of course he does. He never came home again. So here he is foreshadowing his entire story. Maester Lewin gives the bad advice, a different time, a different king. Yes, Ned said dully. He seated himself in a chair by the hearth. Catelyn, she just started that fire. It should be like tiny. Catelyn, you shall stay here in Winterfell. His words were like an icy... and that's the interesting thing, is I suppose... This comes out as a surprise. So I now change my mind. Originally, you're kind of thinking that because he does... I suppose I was misremembering the story. Because he is having sex with her, and then she leaves, and then he leaves, and then says, I'm going to refuse him. You think it's because he doesn't want to leave his wife. But in fact, the plan was to bring her originally. She would accompany him to court. Because, after all, Lysa accompanied Jon Arryn. And he was actually just thinking about his dad and his brother dying in King's Landing and all of the events of the past or something. And so, yeah. Yeah, it had nothing to do with any love like that. He doesn't want to go south because it reminds him of his dad. That's it. His words were like an icy draft through her heart. No, she said, suddenly afraid. Was this to be her punishment? Never to see his face again, nor feel his arms around her? Yes, Ned said, in words that would brook no argument. You must govern the North in my stead, while I run Robert's errands. Robert's errands. Robert Aaron. Robert's errands. Robert's errands. Robert Aaron. Sweet Robin. Robert Aaron. Robert's errands. There must always be a Stark in Winterfell. Robb is 14. Soon enough, he will be a man grown. He must learn to rule, and I will not be here for him. Make him part of your councils. He must be ready for when his time comes. And this is also, I'm sorry, but I accidentally pressed the space bar there. This is really foreshadowing all of Kat's story. Because Kat's story is her being Robb's main advisor and following him, right? She is the one that's supposed to she's supposed to be ruling, you know, and or at least, you know, guiding him. He must be ready when the time comes. And of course he's not ready. He's too young. God's will, not for many years. Oh, oh, Maester Lewin. Maester Lewin. Maester Lewin murmured. Maester Lewin, I trust you as I would my own blood. And there's the thing about the Maesters getting the trust. Give my wife your voice in all things great and small. Teach my son the things he needs to know. Winter is coming. Maester Lewin nodded gravely. Then silence fell until Catelyn found her courage and asked the question whose answer she most dreaded. What of the other children? And here's the thing, he's stripping them all from her. Ned stood and took her in his arms and held her face close to his. Rickon is very young, he said gently. He should stay here with you and Robb. The others I will take with me. Oh, I could not bear it, trembling. And what I like about this, I mean, it's actually so hard to believe that, I mean, despite like the research and I'd have to look at the drafts myself, but we're again signaled Lysa's motivation right here at the beginning, that taking children from a mother is the thing that motivates the action. Catelyn is sitting there going, oh my God, you're taking my kids away from me. I can't bear it. And that Lysa is, you know, would do the same thing. It ends up so perfect that all the answers are right here at the beginning. And it's so weird that these versions were perhaps written without that in mind, because it ends up being so perfect. At least what I think the Lysa story, the Lysa Jon Arryn murder. You must, he said. Sansa must wed Joffrey. That is clear now. We must give them no grounds to suspect our devotion. And it is past time that Arya learn the ways of a southern court. In a few years, she will be of an age to marry too. Sansa would shine in the south, Catelyn thought to herself. And the gods knew that Arya needed refinement. I always thought I had an English teacher in high school that hated the phrase thought to oneself, thought to myself, thought to herself, thought to himself. Because he's like, who else are you going to think to? I mean, unless you're writing sci-fi and there's telepathy, who are you thinking to? I mean, I guess this story has telepathy, but yeah, it's you don't need the to yourself. You can say something to yourself and you can think, but you can't really think to yourself. I mean, you always think to yourself. Reluctantly, she let go of them in her heart. But not Bran, never Bran. Yes, she said, but please, Ned, for the love you bear me, let Bran remain here at Winterfell. He is only 7. so weird, right? Like she's like, yes, that sounds. First of all, who cares? Who cares about Arya? But yeah, Sansa's gonna do great in the South. But don't take Bran, no. I was 8 when my father sent me to foster at the Eyrie, Ned said. Sir Roderick tells me that there is a bad feeling between Robb and Prince Joffrey. That is not healthy. Bran can bridge that distance. He is a sweet boy, quick to laugh, easy to love. Let him grow up with the young princes. Let him become their friend as Robert became mine. Our house will be safer for it. Yeah, I don't know how Bran can bridge the distance between Robb and Joffrey. I don't really get that. You know, I don't because Bran is so likable that Joffrey's gonna like Bran. You know, is that the idea that he admits that Robb is unlikable, but Bran is likable, so Joffrey would like Bran? And I mean, it might be that the ages are I don't know if the ages are played around with or something in an original draft, but like maybe Joffrey and Bran were closer in age or something, or it's weird how this 7-year-old Bran. Yeah, you know, Bran needs to go because Robb and Joffrey don't like each other, and Bran's 7, and everybody loves Bran. And it's so weird because like Catelyn's reaction to it is, he was right. Catelyn knew it. What? You know, like what? I mean, the idea that, okay, no, I'm sorry. The idea is that Bran and Joffrey would become really good friends, and therefore Joffrey would then start liking Robb. Even though Robb is still in the north, Robb's nowhere near them. Or this idea that like Robb would be like, well, Joffrey's friends with Bran, but Joffrey's like 5 years 5 years older than Bran. But like, it's such a weird. It's a weird logic, and it's weird for Catelyn to be like, yup, good reasoning. Good reasoning. You know, like Joffrey's already going to be married to Sansa. So if there were going to be a bridge, it would be Sansa. That Joffrey would have to start liking Robb because of Sansa. But this idea that like Joffrey would become really good friends with Bran. I mean, they talk, you know, it's weird. Over the course of what, like 5 or 6 years, you know, or something. They're living at court together. What's funny is Joffrey, you know, Sweet Robin is there. We never hear about Joffrey. Like, you know, Joffrey didn't like Sweet Robin, you know, like, and Sweet Robin didn't like Tommen. And it's weird. Kind of weird. It's a weird line. She would lose all 4 of them then. Ned, both girls, and her sweet, loving Bran. Well, I guess Arya's in that both girls there. Only Robb and Little Rickon would be left to her. She felt lonely already. Winterfell was such a vast place. Keep him off the walls, then, she said bravely. You know how Bran loves to climb. Ned kissed the tears from her eyes before they could fall. Thank you, my lady, he whispered. This is hard, I know. What of Jon Snow, my lord? Maester Luwin asked. Catelyn tensed at the mention of the name. Ned felt the anger in her, and he pulled away. Many men fathered bastards. Catelyn had grown up with that knowledge. It came as no surprise to her, in the first year of her marriage, to learn that Ned had fathered a child on some girl chance met on campaign. He had a man's needs, after all, and they had spent that year apart. Ned off at war in the south, while she remained safe in her father's castle at Riverrun. Her thoughts were more of Rob, the infant on her breast, than the husband she scarcely knew. He was welcome to whatever solace he might find between battles, and if his seed quickened, she expected he would see the child's he would see to the child's needs. So, yeah. So here we find out that actually Rob was born at Riverrun. So, and earlier in the chapter, she said that Lewin delivered all their kids, and so it's like I understand it. Like now it's not even a retcon; it's like contradiction in the chapter. Unless Lewin was the maester at Riverrun. But nonetheless, we got this idea that John should be younger than Rob, because it says very clear that they spent time apart, and then her husband was off on campaign. So this isn't like this isn't like the fisherman's daughter situation where he's heading home to call his banners and get somebody pregnant. Okay. John should absolutely be younger than Rob. But, and here we find that also we get this idea of how long the war is. It's a year. So, but of course John looks older. So, and later, it's weird that, there was a draft where John was older, because that's an immediate giveaway that he's not Ned's bastard. Anyway, we have no idea what campaigns Ned was on, because from what we know, Ned was at the Battle of the Bells, and then there's a really large gap between it and the Trident, and we don't know what Ned was doing. It's never explained. The Trident's like, what? Like a week away, like march of a week, maybe 2 weeks away on foot. But I think he'd be a horse. What was he doing for like good seven months? But of course the geography and everything isn't worked out here. So he did more than that. The Starks were not like other men. Ned brought his bastard home with him and called him son for all the North to see. When the wars were over at last and Catelyn rode to Winterfell, John and his wet nurse had already taken up residence. Yeah, so John arrived there first. That cut deep. Ned would not speak of the mother. Not so much a word, but a castle had no secrets, and Catelyn heard her maids repeating tales that they heard from the lips of her husband's soldiers. They heard of Sir Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, deadliest of the 7 knights of Aerys' Kingsguard, and how their young lord had slain him in single combat. Later contradicted, because it's not single combat. It's like a rumble. So, a little retcon here, but I guess you just go all the stories, but or maybe the rumble ended and then there was single combat, but and they told how afterwards Ned had carried Sir Arthur's sword back to the beautiful young sister who had awaited him in a castle called Starfall on the shores of the Summer Sea. The Lady Ashara Dane, tall and fair, with haunting violet eyes. George loves his violet eyes. It had taken her a fortnight to marshal her courage, but finally, in bed one night, Catelyn had asked her husband the truth of it. Asked him to his face. And that was the only time in all their years Ned had ever frightened her. Never ask me about John, he said, cold as ice. He is my blood, and that is all you need to know. And now I will hear where you heard that name, my lady. She had pledged to obey, she told him. And from that day on, the whispering had stopped, and Ashara Dane's name was never heard in Winterfell again. So, One thing that I'll remember, like in my very early R plus L equals D video, Tower Tower Joy Joy, one major thing about like that I put forward in that video that I still ask this question today for all of those people that say like R plus L equals J. Where's the A? Like, how is Ashara related to the story? In what way is Ashara related to the story? Because very clearly, Catelyn asks Ned about the story of Arthur Dayne and the single combat and going to Starfall and seeing Lady Ashara. And he says, never ask me about Jon. Now, even accepting R plus L equals J, what's the relationship of Ashara? How does she relate to the whole thing? It's never explored in the show, you know, and when you go these classic tales of like, oh, Rhaegar and Lyanna were in love and they went off to the tower and then she died in childbirth and then they had Jon. How does Ashara Dayne fit into this story? Because Ashara Dayne has to be in the story somehow, and it's never been hinted at. It's never been hinted at. You know, somehow we have like Ned Dayne being milk brothers with Jon and something, but it's never explained. And I've never heard a good story. I've never heard a good theory besides like Ashara being the mother or something like that, or some baby swap, or there being more than one baby and her being in on the conspiracy of keeping babies alive. Like, what is her role? You know? And I don't even know if George knows, you know? There's so little on Starfall and so little on Ashara Dayne in the whole series that I'm not sure. I think it's like the mystery box. You know, he created a mystery box and he himself doesn't know what's in it. Whoever Jon's mother had been, Ned must have loved her fiercely, for nothing Catelyn said would persuade him to send the boy away. It was the one thing she could never forgive him. She had come to love her husband with all her heart, but she had never found it in her to love Jon. She might have overlooked a dozen bastards for Ned's sake, so long as they were out of sight. Jon was never out of sight, and as he grew, he looked more like Ned than any of the true-born sons she bore him. Somehow that made it worse. Jon must go, she said now. And that is the interesting thing of Jon looking even more northern than the other kids. This gets into the people have these theories about Starkcest, but you know. He and Rob are close, Ned said. I had hoped. He cannot stay here, Catelyn said, cutting him off. He is your son, not mine. I will not have him. It was hard, she knew, but no less the truth. Ned would do the boy no kindness by leaving him here at Winterfell. The look Ned gave her was anguished. You know I cannot take him south. There will be no place for him at court. A boy with a bastard's name. You know what they will say of him. He'll be shunned. And they really, yeah, I mean, they kind of retconned like how bad it was to be a bastard. It's much worse to be a bastard at the beginning here, with Jon thinking his life is hopeless and all of this. And later on, bastards are all over the place, and it's not so bad. Like the idea of bringing a bastard to court is like, you know, it's like Cersei's uncle Gary has a bastard daughter, you know, like it's how is it unseemly when like Cersei's uncle has, you know, that Cersei has a bastard cousin. How is it unseemly, you know, or the king's? But anyway, they kind of say this. They say Catelyn armored her heart against the mute appeal of her husband's eyes. They say your friend Robert has fathered a dozen bastards himself, and none of them had ever been seen at court, Ned blazed. Now, we're not sure if he's using dozen as just, an exaggeration. We certainly don't know how many bastards Robert has. We kind of, I understand that people take the Maggie the Frog prophecy, but that number, she's pulling a number out of nowhere. No one, like, this seems to be the public number seems to be around a dozen, but we only know of what, five or six, like Gendry, Edric, Maya, why people would be like, he's got a dozen. And none of them has never been seen at court, Ned blazed. The Lannister woman has seen to that. How can you be so damnably cruel, Catelyn? He is only a boy. Now, of course, the Lannister woman not having Robert's bastards around is a lot different than having any bastards around. Again, I mean, obviously, like, he didn't think about Joy Hill and Uncle Gary at this point, but, it's the fury was on him. He might have said more or worse, but Maester Lewin cut him off. Another solution presents itself, he said, his voice quiet. Your brother Benjen came to me about Jon a few days ago. It seems the boy aspires to take the black. Now, this is a very sneaky scene because Benjen was against Jon joining the Night's Watch. And Lewin leaves that information out. Benjen did not want Jon to join the Night's Watch. And it's strange that Benjen even would go to Lewin. I mean, I understand that the scene has to work and Lewin's the one in the scene. So, I was talking to Benjen. There's that kind of convenience. But it doesn't really make sense that Benjen would like go to Lewin and tell this story to him, especially when Benjen is against it. It seems very sneaky, but nonetheless, this is something that Lewin is doing for Catelyn. Lewin fought for Catelyn before, and now he's taking Catelyn's side and getting rid of Jon. Ned looked shocked. He asked to join the Night's Watch. Catelyn said nothing. Let's start. Ned work it out in his own mind. Her voice would not be welcome now. Yet gladly she would have kissed the maester just then. It was the perfect solution. Benjen Stark was a sworn brother. Jon would be a son to him, the child he would never have. And there's another reference to Benjen lamenting the fact that he's never had a child. Because he talks about the things he gives up is having a child. And so Jon would be that child. Kind of interesting. What is it? What is it about Benjen? It's almost like, maybe Benjen loved somebody and she died in childbirth or something like that. And he felt bad. And so he joined the Night's Watch or something like that. And also lamented the lost child or something like that. But it's straight, And in time, the boy would take the oath as well. He would father no sons who might someday contest Catelyn's own grandchildren for Winterfell. This is an interesting line as well. I bring this one up a lot because people often say, like, why, if say you're saying that Jon is the child of Brandon, why would Ned keep that secret? And the secret, he keeps it a secret because Jon would then be elder, and from the elder brother, especially if all of a sudden you're thinking that maybe Brandon secretly got married, that Catelyn is constantly worried about Jon usurping Robb or his children usurping Robb. And here you find out that right here, this is one of her concerns about Jon. He would father no sons who would someday contest Catelyn's own grandchildren for Winterfell. That maybe Jon himself wouldn't because Jon's a bastard, but his kids would then be trueborn, or something like that. So Jon, like Catelyn definitely fears the succession situation of Winterfell. And so it would make sense that like, to claim Jon's a bastard, even if he's Brandon's child instead of Lyanna's. Because, Brandon's the elder. Maester Lewin said, "This is a great honor and service of the. There's a great honor and service on the wall, my lord. And even a bastard may rise high in the night's watch," Ned reflected. Still his voice was troubled. This is the thing, like, again, this, like, retcon of the Dream for Spring, where, his plan was to make him a lord of a holdfast. And now he's like, oh, no, bastards have no future. No future. The retcon right there. Jon is so young. If he asked this when he was a man grown, that would be one thing. But a boy of 14, a hard sacrifice, Mr. Lewin agreed. Yet these are hard times, my lord. His road is no crueler than yours or your lady's. Catelyn thought of the 3 children she must lose. It was not easy keeping silent then. Ned turned away from them to gaze out the window, his long face silent and thoughtful. Finally he sighed and turned back. Very well, he said to Lewin. I suppose it is for the best. I will speak to Ben. When shall we tell Jon? The maester asked. When I must. Preparations must be made. It will be a fortnight before we are ready to depart. I would sooner let Jon enjoy these last few days. Summer will end soon enough, and childhood as well. When the time comes, I will tell him myself. So yeah, it's all the action now of the story begins. I really do like this chapter. It's again filled with so many retcons and errors, but it's a great chapter. It's funny. I mean, it's also just like hilarious. Cat trying to build this fire. Like, are they really sitting there for like half an hour as she's building this fire? Ned's semen dripping down her legs. But also the people, the introduction of like Ned's backstory and what went on between Brandon and Lyanna and Ashara Dane, and there's never really been a good explanation. After all of this time, no fan has really come up with a good explanation for the backstory that really makes sense, that fits, and still people argue about it, So, yeah, I'd love to see a good, a good story, a good explanation, anything that would explain like how Ashara Dane fits into Rhaegar and Lyanna, and why Brandon gets a statue, and why Benjen, wants kids and is on the wall. All of this, it all should be part of, it all should be part of like one good story together, but it's not. We just kind of guess. Nothing's been, no inkling even really of what happened. Anyway, that's all. I guess I'll talk to you guys later.